everybody. Bonjour. Welcome to the Nuji Center and another episode of Jiibaakwedaa. My name is Ed Metelica, one of the peer specialists who work here. Behind camera, we have Justin Hansen, another peer specialist who works here. And today, we have a special episode. We have a guest, Jim Pete, who's going to be sharing a very traditional and ancient recipe with us. And he's going to be teaching me how to make it and all of us. We'll post this video early part of next week, and the ingredients, I understand, are very simple, so we won't be giving out ingredients on this one. So I just want everyone to sit back and enjoy, and glad that you're here visiting us. Let me introduce Jim Pete.
Well, bonjour, Anin, and then away Maganadug. Nimitwitchwindam, Gakinaway, the Bijay, Gama, Ninajana cause, Guyaushk, Minoa, Anishinaabe, Jim Pete, Jiibaakwedaa, Jiibaakwedaa, and Jiibaakwedaa, Miskwaabikaang, and Jiibaakwedaa. I said welcome, my relatives, and I'm glad that you're able to be here today. I also said that in the Anishinaabe, my spirit or Indian name is Guyaushk or Seagull, and in English it's Jim Pete, and I come from Redcliff. And when I was growing up, one of the terms that the elders would use for Redcliff was Jiibaakwedaa, which refers to, translates out to there is a bay. So if you go down by the casino, in the marina, there is that bay there. Long time ago, when they'd be going around hunting, fishing, gathering, they would come into this area and they would refer to that as there is a bay, which then eventually turned into Redcliff. Today it's also known as Buffalo Bay. And then another name that we have is Miskwaabikaang, which relates or translates out to the red sandstone cliffs along the lake shore. And that I'm also from the Eagle clan. It's a real honor and privilege to be able to share this, something that I learned growing up, because it was such a staple for many of us. And there's different names for it. In Redcliff we call it lug or Lug-a-Laid. Some places will call it bannock bread, Cowboy bread. Menominees call it nanapun, and some of the tribes out in California would call it sand bread. And so again, it's probably the same kind of bread, it just goes by different names. From what I understand, the way this started many years ago is as we interacted with the federal government, the traders, the missionaries, and they would bring things in and they would trade with us. One of those is that they would bring in some different supplies, which was supposed to be helpful to us for our food supplies. Unfortunately, they were not very healthy because they were like lards and sugars and flour and things that we weren't really accustomed to, because we would receive and harvest our food naturally, with the plants and the berries and the medicines, and then the animals, for our food. But we went through a change, and part of that was a transition where we went sometimes from giving up our total traditional foods into these supplies that were provided to us, and then learn how to do that. So one of those is the lug or Lug-a-Laid that we say in this area. The other one is, which many of you know and I'm sure have had many times, is the fried bread. Again, it wasn't totally traditional to us, but it's been integrated into our culture. And I always say, if you have a gathering and if you don't have fried bread there's a near riot. So that's kind of how it's become a part of our, modern day culture. In learning this, not only from my mother, but from other ones throughout the years, it's just basic supplies. Again, there's flour, there's eggs, there's baking powder, dry milk, sugar, and salt. Sometimes, again, people would use different pieces. Again, what we have to remember is that it came into our existence at a time when food could be very scarce, and it was a food that was used for survival. So if they didn't have the baking powder, I know that they would use baking soda. Well, that changed it a little bit. but they had to use what they had, you know, in order to have food to survive. And so in learning this, again, it's one of those recipes where you just kind of throw this and throw that in there. And a few years ago, I was asked if I could translate it into a recipe. So we'll have kind of a recipe, I guess, that's available. Some of you probably might have already seen it because I've shared this on Facebook, and it goes over the recipe. So it says on the recipe about a half a cup, about a fourth of a cup, well, it's about a handful. So the first part of this, again, is starting with the flour. Even when I do the fried bread, I start with 4 cups of flour, and as we go along, you know, add to it, and sometimes it ends up being actually about 8 cups of flour, you know, that's used in making this. So the first part you do.
I like your precise measuring cup here.
Yes, and this was my mother's. She's going to be passed away 30 years in September. So this was her cup. And one time when I went down to the school in the home ec room to make the bread, I used their measuring cup, and it just didn't turn out. Well, the reason it didn't turn out the right way is because I didn't have the cup, you know.
The about a cup.
The about a cup did. So for the baking powder, again, about this much, maybe a fourth of a cup. Please, for those people that are professional bakers, don't be too hard on me on this when I say about. Old-time cooks will know when you say about, you know, pinch of this. So the same with the sugar. Same with the dry milk. Again, most of these things you can get down at our local commodity shed. Or you can trade with people. Sometimes I'll put on Facebook, if anybody has any dried milk, you know, let me know. And so then it's just stirring it up. Also what I did was, to get ready for this, the oven was set at 350. And then this is the pan that'll be used, and I put some oil on there. In one part of the recipe, again, it's taking from a long time ago, when it says to use, I use cooking oil right now most of the time, you know, just the plain old cooking oil. But also what they would use is bacon grease. So, you know, they would cook the bacon, they would say that the grease would be used for a lot of different things. And so sometimes when I make it, I'll use the bacon grease to kind of make sure that we're doing it in that old-fashioned way. As we get started with the mixing up, there's 3 eggs that are being used. When you make different things, everybody has their own little bitty techniques that they use. And one of the ones that seems to work for me when you use water is having it lukewarm, not hot water, but kind of a lukewarm. Somebody else will make it and they'll just put water in there, you know, cold water. So let's bring it over here. And it's kind of using a judgment, so it's like about that much water. The 3 eggs.
Without the shells, I see.
Without the shells. Don't be surprised sometimes if there's a little shell that you bite into. That's not going to hurt you. And then also, again, I really don't know how much, but about that much of the cooking oil. And so one part then is to, you know, kind of start stirring it up. You want your dough to be kind of sticky, and then that's, like I said, then add flour to it as you go along here. And so if you need to put a little bit more water in, then you can do it. If the dough isn't sticky and it it comes out kind of hard dough. You're probably going to have a hard loaf of Lug-a-Laid. So to me, when it looks like about that, that's about ready for the next step, which is like the kneading of it. And again, I can't quite say how much I would be using. Sometimes it's maybe 6 to 7 to 8 cups of flour that's added to here, and then you just start kneading it. And after you make it so much, you kind of can just tell how it feels when it's ready. So I guess part of the telling it's ready, is if it's still kind of sticky but not too sticky. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's the artist's touch, getting the dough just right. So watch closely, everybody.
Not that I even cook that way, but I like watching those cooking shows on PBS.
Oh, yes.
And there was one with Julia Child when she was still alive, and she would have people, as she got older, she'd have people come in and make things. And they were making some kind of a French bread. And the lady that was doing it, of course, had made it for like years and years. And she said, you have to knead it and turn it over 850 times. Of course, if you're just learning, then you're counting 1, 499, 500. Well, because she did it so much, she was able to, tell when it was ready just based on that. So you can see the dough now. This is where it's just about ready. If I was to add more flour, it would be too heavy, too thick. But again, it's based on the feel. So when I was growing up, my mother, Elma Morris Livingston Peterson, when she would make things, of course, like a lot of people, they would just throw it together, and so it was like, watching, and then eventually, showing and learning, and then eventually I would start making it, and sometimes when it didn't turn out, she'd be kind, but she said, you didn't do this, you didn't do that. So you learn, like sometimes like trial and error. What I've learned with this is, when you first put it down on the pan with the oil, then you turn it over and then you kind of start spreading it out.
Okay.
This in the sink.
Yeah.
So it's spreading it out. In our home, when my mother and my aunties and uncles, when they would make the Lug-a-Laid, it was just like a plain loaf. When Susie Brzett Gordon, on my mother's side, she was a cousin, and on my dad's side, she was my aunt. So most time refer to her as old Auntie Sue. And she was a short woman, but yet very, very active, very artistic. Learning a lot of things from her in terms of utilizing, the natural stuff around here for artwork. And when she would visit, or when she would make the Lug-a-Laid, for some reason in her learning, I guess, is she would put either salt pork or bacon on it. And so what I do is sort of in honor of her and to remember her for everything that she shared with not only me but also in the community. Then I kind of do this where it's like half with the bacon or salt pork and half plain. Her daughter, Mildred Gordon Hanson, again, was another one of those natural cooks that could cook for 2 people or 200 people without breaking a sweat. And so when Millie would make the bread, again, she would do it the same like her mother, with putting on the bacon or the bacon It's all pork on there.
Jim, I noticed you were using the knife. I thought you were cutting through, but then it looked like you were just scoring it. What were you doing there?
Well, again, in learning this from different people, most of the time it would be just a solid loaf. And when they would serve it, they would just rip it.
Okay.
But what I learned is if you kind of make these little indentations, it helps for people to know how much they could or should take instead of just ripping it. But sometimes people still rip it, it doesn't matter. I'm going to share a story in a little bit about Lug and how that came into our community and in other parts. But there was a time when recently when a young person had asked if they ever had Lug-a-Laid, and they said no. And it was a real concern because from what I've learned throughout the years is we have in our, as Anishinaabe people, you know, we have these common things amongst us, like with our language, there's different things, but yet then it's broken down where it's kind of specific to like a community or a region. So there's like different dialects, there's different ways of saying different things. And even in this day and age, you know, the way that we do things here might be a little bit different from Bad River, Elcio, Lac de Flambeau, but we still have this commonness. And so part of this is, you know, that this is how we would do it in Redcliff. So when I heard that person saying, young person saying, I don't know what that is, it was a real concern to me because we've had something like this in our community for like 200 years, and all of a sudden it's starting to be lost. And so not that I'm this big lug maker, but you know, I started doing it, and then like doing kind of videos like this, sharing things. And then when usually there's a funeral, you know, people bring food and they donate and do this and that. And my donation has been over the last like 10, 15 years is this pan of lug. And it surprises me when I'm starting to go into the funeral service to bring it, there's people that are just waiting for me, and they'll follow me to the table, and sometimes they'll rip open a piece. Again, it's that idea of, you know, what it represents to us. And so it'll be put in the oven, 350 for maybe about 45 minutes or so. Not only about, then there's a or so.
Right.
And like I mentioned, I like to watch those cooking shows, and not that I would cook that way. Can I clear this?
Yeah.
What I did though is I made one at home so that you know, we wouldn't have to wait for 45 minutes so that you could see what it looks like. And, there's such great care that's taken with this. Because it's not just a hard to grow, it's this creation, this teaching that we have that goes back, you know, like I said, hundreds of years. And yes, it wasn't originally traditional to us, but it's become a part of our community culture. And I thought and think that we need to share this. We need to make sure that people understood what it represents, and that it was our elders and our ancestors that had this, that they used for their basic survival. It surprises me when I post like a picture of this, like on Facebook and other media like that, is that a lot of people that are in their 70s and 80s will have these reflections, and they'll share stories of when they were growing up, and sometimes the only thing that they had to eat was this pan of lug. And again, it was like just basically used for survival, you know, so that people could eat and have those. So at the end, this is what it looks like.
Too bad they can't smell it on camera because it smells delicious.
But again, in trying to share some of this, and you know, trying to have create an understanding about it. Again, there was things that were we do now, that's a part of our culture, community culture, that's just automatic. And but yet, you know, it's not totally traditional. And so this is a book that was developed, Fried Bread, Past, Present, and Future. And what's interesting, when you look at this, it goes back to like 400 or 500 years on how that sort of started making its way into our just normal community culture on our tribes. And the other part on here is then there's, there is like 300 recipes in here.
Just for fried bread?
Just for fried bread.
Wow.
From a lot of different tribes and communities and people. And so again, with the fried bread, you know, we usually hear it's about that big. You go to the Southwest and they have it, you know, like that. That's this big. And last week or so, they had a special on TV about fried bread in the Southwest, and they talked about how again that got into their community and how the people learn how to make it, and so they're known by that way about how big their fried bread is. Again, each community is a little bit different. Not that I'm a writer, but I've been trying to share these different things with hopes that people will learn, people will understand. Again, some of the older ones, I'm 65, and I don't mind telling it my age because when I grew up in Redcliff, we started going through a lot of transition in the late 50s, 60s, 70s. So when I was growing up in Redcliff in the early 60s, a majority of people didn't have running water. They didn't have, you know, the indoor toilets. You know, we had the outhouses. We had what we called a slop pail, you know, to do our duties.
Yeah.
And they would take them out, you know, and dump them out. And then people started to get water and then sewer. A lot of times people didn't have electricity, and then, you know, again, it started changing in the mid 60s. Many times most people didn't have the phones. You know, there might have been one person in the community that had a phone, and they were the kind of like central point for somebody trying to contact from the outside. And so part of this is sharing these things, is trying to create an awareness of what it means and represents to us as Redcliff with our community culture, and things that need to be I think need to be shared, need to be documented, so that somewhere in the future people can learn and understand, you know, how we went through a lot of these changes. Again, we talk about this integration of things, and so in this area, not only with the Norwegian or Swedish people, but we had a lot of interaction with the French people. So you know, we have a lot of people that I guess if you go back, their last names are more come from the French, like Brzet and Lafreniere and Soulier. And so there was that interaction and then, you know, how they came into our community. And so again, with when I was growing up with some of the elders that are no longer with us, you know, they would have not only their English name, but they would also have what I thought was a Indian name, but it was kind of a sort of a French combined Ojibwe way of saying it. So one of the names that we had was, for Charlotte, was Janud. For Margaret was Magid. For Elizabeth was Nezabane. For Frank or Franklin, one term that I heard was Joshua. And so it was this integration of things, you know, that were there, trying to combine the two or more different things and how they related to us. And so in doing this, I wrote this article up, and it was probably about in 2006. It's called, "Are We Becoming a Lugless Society?" For most people, the word lug or LugaLaid is probably foreign. Within the Redcliff community, many of us know lug as a baked bread our parents, grandparents would make on a regular basis. For me, it was comfort food because of the memories it brings back. A few months ago, a young travel member was asked if she wanted a piece of lug, and didn't know what it was. And to me, this was disturbing. It made me think of the transition of our community by losing parts of the Redcliff community Indian culture as older people pass away and the younger people are becoming the next generation. First, let me give my definition of lug. It comes from having it as a normal part of growing up in Redcliff. Lug is a baked bread. The ingredients I was taught by my mother Elma are flour, salt, sugar, baking powder, dry milk, eggs, bacon grease, and water. As you stir the ingredients together, you mix it into a dough, form a ball to knead it for a few times, and bake it in the oven. Many years ago, Dolores Bainbridge was reading a book, the name I don't remember, and it had various pieces of the history of the Redcliff area. And in the book, which is a collection of accounts from fur traders in our area in the 1800s, it mentions a bread called lug, which had become a regular part of our diet. The ingredients were probably items used to trade between the local Anishinaabe and traders. In other tribes, there appears to be versions of lug called bannock, cowboy bread, nanapun, sand bread. There are other tales of lug dough being wrapped around a branch. The dough was wrapped around the branch and it was placed up against a campfire and it was baked that way. They would turn it. By these accounts, lug has been a part of our lives for at least 200 years. At a gathering in Redcliff a few years ago, there was a feast, lots of good food, and someone brought lug to the feast. A young tribal member came into the feast and was so excited about the lug. As I watched her, she was mouthing to her mother, who was way across the room, the word lug. She was going. I guess the mother couldn't lip read the message, but it was loud and clear. And I enjoyed watching this little interaction between the two again, and thought of the importance of the tradition in our community. Again, I wrote this story about 2006. So for the second year in a row, I hosted a lug luncheon for a couple of relatives from Modena. Each time we gathered, we'd have lug, salt pork, white rice, potatoes with the jackets on, and pork grease. For many, this was kind of a normal part of our eating at home. It was from a time when resources were scarce and our parents and grandparents had to make everything go as far as it would go, and yet very inexpensive. I laughed to myself as we were sitting in the dining room with matching dishes, cups, saucers, knives, forks, spoons, and our grandparents would have had the same meal sitting at the kitchen table next to the old wood stove with a slop pail in the corner, and someone just went out to fill up a pail of water at the local pump. What a difference a generation or two makes. This gathering has become important for me because it helps me remember my parents, grandparents, and other relatives. It helps to remember the closeness of our families and the community in the old days, a nice, warm, and comforting memory of our recent past. Other recollections I have about lug is a different manner in which families fixed it. In our family, we made it plain, where it didn't have the bacon on there. But other families, they would do it differently, where they would have bacon or salt pork placed on it while it baked in the oven. My old Aunt Sue, like I mentioned before, would make a big pan of lug with bacon on top, and her daughter, Millie Hansen, would do the same. Many people remember the gatherings, and they would say, "Oh, when Millie made the lug," a nice, warm, and comforting memory of our recent past. I have memories of my grandma Angela and Gordon Peterson making lug, and then with her piece would punjigay that lug into her eggs or into the gravy or into the grease. So punjigay means you dip that something into the egg yolk and or the gravy. In the 1960s, my cousin Diane Bear Defoe was at the house to pick my sister Mary up because they were going out. Mary had just finished her supper, which included Lug-a-Laid. Diane was all excited about the lug that was on the table and asked my dad, Louis, Uncle Butts Peterson, if she could take a piece with her, and he said, "You'll just meet some boys and you'll throw it out anyway." Well, she took some, and when a car with boys stopped to pick them up, Diane threw her lug in the ditch. Salt pork cut into pieces, boiled and fried is a natural fit with lug. For the annual lug luncheon, I invited Marlene DePerry Pap. However, she couldn't make it, but shared this little story. And again, thinking back, it was at that time probably 70 years ago. She said many years ago when Auntie Susan, it wasn't Susan, it was Susan Baker Nawago was eating salt pork, Marlene's brother Merle, who was a baby, Merle DePerry, took the piece of lug right out of Auntie Susan's mouth and stuck it in his own mouth and ate it. What a crazy little story, which probably happened over 60 to 70 years ago, and yet we can still laugh at the craziness of it. More nice and warm and comforting memories from our past. So in our community and in families, one way to continue a tradition is to have lug available at feasts, gatherings, encourage people to talk about what it means. I think we'd be surprised on the depth of lug in our culture and how much it is tied back to good times and yes, even bad times. It's a representation of who we are as Anishinaabe. I guess what we need to do is just continue to do. Make lug, not war. A piece of lug in the hand is better than two in the bush. Let them eat lug, and what's love got to do with it? Are we becoming a lugless society? Well, only if we let ourselves be.
Thanks, Jim.
So when, of course, people notice that do a lot of cooking, everybody's got their own little styles. One of the things I learned with this LugaLaid is when it's been in the oven for about a half hour or so, halfway through, is to be able to take it, flip it over on another pan, and put it back in. I'm assuming that it helps, making sure that it's cooked totally and all the way through. But it might be that I just do that because my mother did or somebody else did. Mm-hmm. So I just do it, Somebody might analyze that. Well, don't analyze that. Analyze something else that's more important than me turning over the LugaLaid.
Well, I'm glad you shared that with us, though, because that's...
So again, it didn't used to be like kind of sectioned out because people would just rip it, but it does help, like when you're serving and having like gatherings. So Ed had a piece if you want to share.
Yes, I did. We took a little break here, and actually we had a visitor, and she stole a couple pieces from us, but this is delicious. And Jim brought out the peanut butter and some jam and jelly, and he said it also lends itself really well to chili. So we're going to have some chili and enjoy this. I hope we don't eat the whole thing, but it's really tasty.
Well, when you have the LugaLaid and then the fried bread, as long as you went that far, you've got to have real butter. Don't get that almost tastes like butter or that spread or whatever for 99 cents. Get the real butter. If you're going to do it all the way for this.
Well, I agree. Everything tastes better with butter and with bacon, so can't go wrong. Miigwech, Jim, this is fascinating. It's a great piece of history. I love that you shared all these stories with us too. And the recipe. So I think now whenever we have our little feast here at Nuji, lug was going to be a staple that you can expect here. So Miigwech again. And
again, thank you. Just very honored. I'm not any kind of a big baker or cooker or whatever, just an old reservation guy that throws it together with hopes that it turns out, as it doesn't always.
Well, thanks again, and hope to see you everyone here back at Nuji for another episode of Jiibaakwedaa next month.